Hello everyone and welcome to our Yosef shiur. Today we are starting Siman Sadi Aleph, which discusses how a person should be dressed during tefillah. Sif Aleph begins in the Tur, and as we mentioned, the Tur gave us in the previous Siman guidelines to the following Simanim. He starts off saying, Tikun begadav ketzad, how should a person prepare his clothing? He brings the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, which says that Rabba bar Rav Huna, Rami Puzmaki, he would wear certain socks. Umatzle, Pirush, Hayami Kashe bebete shukaim b'shat tefillah. Amar Rashi, Hazin ala Rav Kahana, ki ika ritha ba'alma, pachar yadeh umatzle, ki abda kamed mare, v'chilek ritha mitzayin nefshe umatzle. The Torah explains, when there was trouble, za'am in the world, he would hold his hands tight, derech tzar, and he wouldn't wear, Rashi explains in the Gemara, they wouldn't wear special clothing. He would pray b'derech tzar. However, when there was shalom in the world, he would wear important clothing. Ha'mitkashet b'gadim na'im u'mitpalel. The Rambam in Hilchot Tefillah Perek Hey reads as follows: Tikun ha'malbushim ketzad b'tekin malbushav tehila u'mitzayen asmo u'mehader shene'emar ishtahavu laHashem behadrat kodesh. The Rambam says that a person should prepare his clothing, be well dressed, using the lashon of hidur, something important and special. Though Maran and the Shulchan Aruch does not specifically bring these halachot, it's clear that they are the halakha. It's a Rambam, it's a Tur, and it's a Gemara b'Firush. The Rama at the end of the Siman does bring the deen about holding your hands tight when there's a trouble in the world, and when there's et shalom, you should wear important clothing. The Tur and the Beit Yosef continue and they discuss the Gemara, which explains that there's a difference between Kirat Shema and Amida in regards to covering oneself. If a person, for example, is wearing a towel at his waist, he can read Kirat Shema, however, he cannot pray the Amida. The Beit Yosef brings the explanation of Rashi, who explains that when preparing for the Amida, a person needs to present himself as if he is standing in front of the king. He should be with great awe and with trepidation. However, Kirat Shema is not on that level. It's not on the level of speaking in front of the king. Kirat Shema eno medaber lifnei hamelech. And therefore, if he's wearing a towel and he's covering his erva, it's sufficient. However, tefillah requires that both his heart and his body are covered, not just that liboro eno roe et ha'erva. However, if a person did not or cannot cover himself, the Rambam does teach us that he is yotzeh b'di'avad. However, he should not do this. As he says, L'chatechila lo ya'aseh ken, and the Achronim discuss what the Rambam means with this interesting lashon. Maran in Sif Aleph reads as follows: Hayta talit hagura al motnav lechasato mimotnav ulemata, from his waist down. Asur lehitpalel ad sheyichaseh libo, v'im lo kisah et libo, o shene'enas ve'en lo b'mash yitkaseh, hoye v'kisah ervato v'hitpalel yatsa. Like we said, L'chatechila, the proper way to pray. Maran even says, Asur lehitpalel ad sheyichaseh libo. However, b'di'avad, or if he doesn't have anything else, yatsa. Seif Bet begins with a discussion which starts in Masechet Shabbat, which discusses the concept of Tefilat Arbit Reshut. Abaye says that if the men, the Bavlim, who used to wear a certain kind of belt or a sash on top of their robe, he says that once they untied it, they are exempt from praying Arbit. Rav Sheshet has two questions on this. First, is it really that difficult to tie the belt and to pray? Secondly, what's the big deal? Pray without tying the belt. The Gemara gives one answer. Mishun hikon likrat elokecha Yisrael. Meaning that before you prepare your meeting with the Lord, before you greet Borei Olam, you should prepare yourself and you should dress properly. The Beit Yosef brings three explanations on what we learn from this Gemara. First, he brings the Sefer Terumah, who is also the opinion of the Ran and the Gaot Mamniot, who explain that we see from this Gemara that a person should always wear a belt during prayers, even if he's wearing pants, which covers himself. The concept of a belt is important for tefillah in order to fulfill the level of hikon likrat elokecha. The Tosafot and the Rosh, at first glance, maintain like the Sefer Terumah. However, they both bring the Mahzor Vitri, who explains that the reason why the Gemara required a belt was because in their times they didn't wear pants. So therefore, their heart would be exposed to the arva, their private parts. And therefore, they had an obligation and a necessity to wear a belt. However, if a person is wearing pants, there is no need for a belt. The Tosafot seem to be posek, like the Mahzor Vitri. However, the Rosh at the end of his statement says, Umiu mitzvah le'ezor mishum hikon likrat Eloheva Yisrael. It sounds like from the Rosh, there's a mitzvah, maybe it's a mitzvah hasidut, maybe it's an obligation. But if we look at the Tur, who's the Rosh's son, he brings the Baal Terumah, and he says, Mikan yesh lemot shetzarich adam le'ezor b'shat tefillah, afilu yesh lo avnet, she'en libo ro'eh et harva. It seems that the Tur and the Rosh possibly agree to the Sefer Terumah that there's a requirement to wear a belt. The third opinion the Beit Yosef brings is Rabbeinu Yeruham. He explains that only a person who wears a belt during the entirety of his day on a normal basis, only that kind of person is required to wear during prayers. However, if a person doesn't usually wear a belt, he's not obligated to wear a belt during prayers. Seemingly, the logic in Rabbeinu Yeruham is the concept we saw in Sif Aleph, that the Tur mentioned that a person should wear foreign clothing, and we're going to also see it at the end of the Siman in the Lashon of the Rambam, that a person needs to approach Tefillah the way he greets important people, Omed Difnei Gdolim, and therefore the possible explanation of Rabbeinu Yeruham is that the way a person normally presents himself in front of important people, that's the way he's required to present himself in front of Borei Olam, and therefore, if a belt is not something that a person normally wears, one can pray without a belt. The Beit Yosef adds an important point from the Ran and the other Rishonim, that even though they do require a belt, it's only during the Amida. Kriyat Shema, other berachot, even Birkat HaMazon, which is a beracha from the Torah, there's no requirement to wear a belt, and as long as there's a separation between the heart and the erva, it's permissible. They prove this from the same Gemara we mentioned, that the rabbis in Bavel, once they opened the belt, they were eating, they were making berachot, they were making bracha rishona, bracha achrona, and they were without the belt, and it was definitely allowed. These opinions are in contradiction to the opinion of Rashi. Rashi holds that a person can make a beracha even if his heart is exposed to the erva. The Beit Yosef and the Derakei Moshe point out that the Ran and the Rosh and other Rishonim clearly argue with Rashi. Maran is posek in Seif Bet as follows: Tzarich le'ezor b'sha'at tefillah, afilu yesh lo avnet she'en libo ro'eh et arva mishum hikon. Aval sha'ar berachot mutar levarech v'lo hagura ahar sheyesh lo mechnasayim. Maran is clearly posek like the Ran and possibly like the Rosh and the Tur, as we mentioned earlier, that a belt is required during tefillah, not like the Tosafot and Mahzor Vitri. The Haggaha says, Ve'en libo ro'eh et arva, meaning, when Maran says Sha'ar berachot is mutar ve'lo hagura, since a person is wearing pants, the Rama explains it's because libo eno ro'eh et arva, which is basically a continuation of the Ran mentioned in the Beit Yosef. Seif Gimel discusses covering one's head. The Torah base says two words, v'yichaser rosho, which means that a person during tefillah should cover his head. The Beit Yosef explains that there's actually a machloket in the Tosefta, whether a person can mention Hashem's name with an uncovered head. The Tosefta brings two opinions, and the Beit Yosef brings that the Rabbeinu Yeruham is strict, and therefore we should follow the opinion of Rabbeinu Yeruham. The Beit Yosef also mentions that there's the opinion of a Kolbo. The Kolbo says that covering one's head in general is not an obligation, but a stringency. It's a midat hasidut. He proves this from the Gemara when one of the Amoraim said that I'm going to receive reward for doing something special. What was it that he did? He didn't work 4 amot without covering his head, which implies that it's not an obligation, rather a midat hasidut. The Kolbo is seemingly not discussing tefillah per se. He's discussing 4 amot in general during the person's day. The Beit Yosef also brings the opinion of Rabbeinu Peretz, who says that it's very important to make sure that nobody enters the synagogue without a head covering. This is sort of a new concept that we see that the Makom Bet Knesset requires a higher level of kavod and respect. Maran and Sif Gimel reads as follows: Yesh omrim shasur leotzi azkara mipiv berosh meguleh. This is the opinion of Rabbeinu Yeruham based on one of the opinions in the Tosefta. Then Maran says ויש אומרים שיש למחות שלא להיכנס בבית הכנסת בגילוי הראש. This is the opinion of Rabbeinu Peretz, who says you should not enter the Beit Knesset, and people should be mocheh, should protest someone who's coming into the Beit Knesset with his head uncovered. Even though Maran brings both of these opinions, b'shem yesh omrim, like we've mentioned many times. Sometimes when there's a psak, this is based on the Sma, Sefer Mirat Elayim in Hoshe Mishpat, Siman Tetzayin, who says that Maran and the Mishnah Berurah also brings this klal many times, and so do many of the Aharonim, that when Maran brings something that's not mentioned in the Poskim HaMuvhakim, it's not mentioned in the Rif Rambam Rosh Drashba, Maran will bring it b'shem yesh omrim. It's not to say it's not halakha. It definitely is the halakha. However, since it's not a deen brought in the major poskim, Maran brings it b'shem yesh omrim. Seif Daled is based on a teshuvah from the Tumat edition, who says that a straw hat, even though it might have some openings, is definitely considered an adequate head covering. However, a person's hand, since it's part of his body and the body cannot cover itself, is not an adequate head covering. However, the Beit Yosef says that if someone else were to cover his friend's head, it would definitely be okay. And Maran and Seif Daled is posek, just as we mentioned, Kova'im, Kapila, Belaz, Hakulim Mikash, Hashiba Kisui, a straw hat, maybe those old plastic baseball caps would be considered a kisui. Aval, Hanahat Yad al Harosh, Lo Hashiba Kisui. V'im Her Maniach Yedo al Rosho Shel Zeh, Mashma da Hashiva Kisui. If someone else puts his hand on his friend's head, it's okay. Maran uses a very interesting lashon. He says Mashma da Hashiva Kisui. He doesn't say have. It could be he's just copying the lashon of the Beit Yosef, but it's interesting when he uses the lashon of Mashma in the Shulchan Aruch. Seif Hey and Vav are from the Rambam and discuss how a person should present himself in prayer during the Amida. The Torah brings the Rambam's lashon, which reads, Lo yamod b'tefilah b'afundato. Fundato is sort of a fanny pack, is sort of a pouch that would go on the belt, maybe even a knapsack. V'lo berosho miguleh, v'lo beraglayim migulot, im derech anshe hamakom shelo yamdu lifnei gedolim ela b'teraglayim. Person should not pray with his head uncovered, like we mentioned earlier, and not with his legs uncovered. However, the Rambam does say, depends on the minhag hamakom, and the Beit Yosef explains that in the Atzot Arav, in the Arabic lands, the custom is to pray without shoes, even without socks, because since people greet Anashim Gedolim, important people, without shoes, barefoot, therefore it's okay to pray in front of Borei Olam in this fashion. Beit Yosef brings that even though the Hagahot Ma'amaniyot clearly says that it's asur to pray without shoes, and he brings the Gemaran Hagigah, which says that it's improper to show your legs. Beit Yosef explains that it really depends on the minhag makom, and possibly the Hagahot Ma'amaniyot is from a place where people do not walk around barefoot. And the Beit Yosef ends off and says, Nahagu ha'olam b'chol eretz ha'arav lehipalel hefim. The widespread custom is to pray without shoes, which is the opinion of the Rambam. The Beit Yosef concludes with one line from the Rambam, who says, Derech kol ha'chachamim v'talmidehem shelo yitpalelu ela keshehem atufin. That the custom of all of the hachamim, all of the wise rabbis and their students, is to pray while they're covered. The Ben Ish Hai writes that even a regular person who's not a Talmid Chacham and not a student should also follow this custom. The question is, what do they mean by atufim? In Shaharit, it's probably the talit. In Minhan Arbit, probably means a respectable coat or jacket, something that shows importance, and atifa. And atifa possibly connotes a concept of yirat shamayim, a concept of humility as a person approaches Borei Olam in tefillah. Seif Hey and Vav in Shulchan Aruch read as follows: Lo yamod b'afundato v'lo berosh miguleh v'lo beraglayim migulim im derech anshe hamakom shelo yamdu lifnei hagedolim ela b'atei raglayim. This is clearly the opinion of the Rambam, like the Beit Yosef explained, that it depends on minhag hamakom whether or not to wear shoes and socks. Seif Vav derech hachamim v'tamidehem shelo yipalelu ela keshehem atufim. They should cover themselves. The Haggadah, as we mentioned at the end, brings the deen that we saw in the beginning of the tour. Ube'et za'am yesh lahabeke yadayim b'shat tefillah Ke'avda kame mare, like a servant in front of his master, he should hold his hands. However, be'et shalom, yesh litkashet begadim na'im litpalel, he should wear finer and more beautiful clothing. Like we mentioned, each siman is going to have one focused topic. We completed Siman Tzadi Aleph today. Bezat Hashem will continue with Siman Tzadi Bet in the next shiur.